Well, Mafeking was headed up by Colonel Baden-Powell, and he was in charge of 600 soldiers that were barely trained, and they had just been recruited from South Africa. He was also given 200 policemen and 300 of the natives, and a few here and there of the 12 to 14-year-old boys that had lived in Mafeking. Well, surrounding the city was a regiment of 8,000 Boer infantrymen. The Boers were the Dutch. They had cavalry and fences, and they had spotlight systems and mines, and everything that you can imagine to blockade and starve out the city of Mafeking. They didn't want to destroy anything that was in there, so they figured if they just held out long enough, they could starve it out. Well, Lord Baden-Powell was definitely undermanned. It was almost 1 to 6, and he had to come up with some pretty crazy ways to defend the city of Mafeking. But he didn't have a whole lot under his wing for resources-wise, and now that he was cut off, their food was limited. They couldn't get reinforcements. They waited and they waited, and about a month or two in, he started to realize that this was going to be a long siege, that he was going to have to start coming up with ways to defend the city. Otherwise the Boers would get restless and they would come and bring in and take over the entire city. So one day, while Lord Baden-Powell was looking through a spotting scope, he could see the Boer infantrymen, as they exited the surrounding perimeter, they would go through and they would duck through this barbed wire fence. Every single day, then they would duck back through. And every once in a while they'd snag their clothing, and you could see them kind of working their way off as they would rip their clothing off. But he couldn't see the barbed wire fence from where he was. So he came up with the idea of telling his soldiers to do the same thing. Anytime they left the trenches surrounding the city, they too would duck down and pretend to go through a barbed wire fence. And to the Dutch, it looked like they had the barbed wire fence surrounding the city. The barbed wire fences weren't going to hold off 8,000 soldiers. Lord Baden-Powell knew this. He had to come up with some other way, so he decided to try and build a minefield. But he only had limited supplies of gunpowder and explosives, and he needed that. So he took all the empty crates that were throughout the city, and he had his soldiers paint them red. And every single day he'd send out battalions of 20. He called them troops. And they would go out in the hot desert sun, they'd find a spot, grab their shovels, and they'd dig a hole. It'd be 6 foot wide, 9 feet deep. They would do it all day, up till about noontime. Then they would slowly, ever so delicately, take these empty crates and lower them slowly into the hole. And then that afternoon, when the hot sun was at its peak, the soldiers would return and bury that crate. It is for several months, and they surrounded the entire city with these empty crates, these mounds of dirt. And on the last couple days, he would take his last sticks of dynamite, throw them in these few other crates and set them off. And he let off the illusion that there was a minefield surrounding the city of Mafeking. But minefields and barbed wire fences were fantastic defenses during the day. But at night, if he couldn't see his soldiers, they were susceptible to covert attacks, where they could come and raid food, or they could burn their towns or their towers or their weaponry storages. He had to have some sort of spotlight system, but he only had one alkaline lamp. That was it. There was no way he could light up the entire city at the same time. So Lord Baden-Powell took all the biscuit tins and all the shiny china and things that were inside the city, and he positioned them on the corners of the buildings throughout the town, all at different angles. And that way he would send out young boys with this alkaline lamps and reflect it off slowly and moving, rotating, making it look like they had a system of elaborate spotlights protecting the city. They had spotlights and barbed wire fences and trenches. They had a minefield now. The Boers could see that they were pretty heavily defensed, but they couldn't hold off for long. Lord Baden-Powell needed more. They are now 6 months into their siege. Their food storages were running out. The people were boiling down the leather off of their shoes, taking their horses and killing them and boiling them into a sort of jello that they could mush between their gums to try and get the nutrients out throughout the day. His people were starving, and Lord Baden-Powell knew that he couldn't hold out much longer. He had to come up with some more ideas though. Defeat wasn't on the table. Lord Baden-Powell offered a year's worth of rations, real food, to the man who could come up with the best way to fool the Boers. And if you can imagine that you're eating your shoes at this point, a year's rations for you and your family, it's like the lottery. This guy's fought hard for it. One guy came up with the idea to take the old rail cars. Since the Dutch didn't want to destroy anything in this town, they hadn't eliminated the rails that ran through their Boer and their infantry lines. So they took the rail cart. Lord Baden-Powell sent 20 of his best sharpshooters into the very heart of the Boer encampment, and they returned safely after taking out a lot of their commanders and a lot of the soldiers. Another thing that they did was they took the men that were trained in welding and skilled in metal work, and they had them build makeshift howitzers. And they would take things of like rocks and sand, and they would wrap them up in leather. They'd tie them up and they'd throw them in, they'd shoot them. And if they could hit the barbed wire fences or the towers just right, it would scare the men and they'd run away. He was just trying to play mind games with them. But the man who won took all of their clothes that they couldn't wash anymore, that were ratty and falling off of them, and he stuffed them full of sand and straw. And they did this for hundreds and hundreds of these makeshift dummies. And they put them inside their towers. And then every single night, soldiers would come and move these dummies and rotate them, turning them, moving their heads, making it appear to the Boer soldiers that they had just gone from 800 soldiers to now 1,500. Well, they were there for a long time. Things were finally running out. Lord Baden-Powell knew that he couldn't sacrifice his men's lives just for a claim to a stake of land. So Lord Baden-Powell, in his wisdom, went out as a crazed butterfly hunter, hopping around with his notebook and his pen. And he would go off into the trees and he would go up around the Boer infantry lines and he would draw down pictures of butterflies. And as these sketches of the butterflies and the wings, he would draw the movements of the troops, where the encampments were, where their storages were, and how, if another soldier could read this, they could break through the lines of the Boers and free the city of Mafeking. Then he would take these pictures of the butterflies and he would give them to 12 to 14-year-old boys. And this was the key. The Boers and the Dutch didn't see a 12 and 14-year-old boy as anything. They weren't men, they weren't skilled enough, they weren't trained enough, they didn't have the integrity or the honor that an older man had. They were nothing. And so, when they would run through the lines, they would just let them go. They wouldn't question them, they'd just let them walk off into the desert. They were nothing. They made the mistake. Because those boys would take those pictures and sell them off in faraway cities and towns in the hope that one of those pictures would end up in the hands of a British officer. And one did. It ended up in the hands of Lord Baden-Powell's brother, who was able to decipher his brother's handiwork, saw what was happening in these wings, and saw the insignia of Lord Baden-Powell, notified the British, and they were able to break the siege of Mafeking after 217 days. 1-6 odds. Well, as you can imagine, this put Lord Baden-Powell at somewhat of a celebrity status. He returned home with many honors and many places in the history books. In fact, there's still an archive in the CIA libraries labeled Lord Baden-Powell's Stratagem and Subterfuge. Lord Baden-Powell returned to England, an honored hero. But what he found when he returned to England was poverty, despair, and a lack of ambition on part of the young men and the youth. In fact, Lord Baden-Powell said in one of his journals that all he could ever see of the boys in the town were street rats. It crushed him to see the potential of these young men go to waste. They'd end up in prison and die alone, never making a difference in the world. So he tried an experiment. He took 15 boys out to a deserted island amongst the trees in the forest. And he dressed them up all in the same shirts, same uniforms. So you couldn't tell who was rich or who was poor. And he tried to train them as soldiers. He taught them everything he knew. everything that he could, that he thought that one of his soldiers could use. But not only did he teach them the skills to survive in the wild, to do first aid, or to understand nature around them, but he taught them the morals and the values that he thought made great men. They thought made real men. And that was the real experiment, to see if those boys could actually catch those ideals and make them a part of themselves. And they did. Lord Baden-Powell returned to England with this experiment complete, and he saw the potential of these young men and what he could do for the world. And whether it was inspired by God or whether it was just him, he decided to write a book. It was called Scouting for Boys. And this book had all the skills he taught his soldiers and all the morals and values that he thought made men. And he handed it to a few of the boys around town and had them read it. Well, these boys didn't have a lot of things we had today. They were living in the streets, picking pockets and trying to make their ends meet. So when they got a hold of this book, it changed their lives. They could make something of themselves. It was cool, it was exciting. They felt like they were something. This book started getting passed around and it spread like wildfire all throughout Europe. First started in England and then spread off into the surrounding countries. And Lord Baden-Powell decided to head up a movement, called it the Scouting Movement. And it's expanded throughout the world. There are 4.5 million Boy Scouts of America here in America. 4.5. But there are 31 million Boy Scouts around the world in over 216 different nations. Most of them are at war with each other. Most of them are different races, different cultures, different languages. But they're all united by the uniform and by this purple patch. Lord Baden-Powell had a vision, and he could see the world in a different way. He wanted to change it and he wanted to make it better. And you guys are a part of that movement. You guys could be a part of that. And you can be scouts and you can be men, and it can change you forever. I know what scouting can do for a young man. I know how it can change their lives, and how it can change the lives of other people around you. You have no idea. But if you guys will take an opportunity this week to look at the trees, and to listen to the wind, and to feel the spirit that's very real up here, you will take away part of that history and part of that spirit that's been around for over 100 years now. And it can and it will change you. I'd like to leave you with the last few parting words of Lord Baden-Powell. These were some of the last words that Lord Baden-Powell spoke while he was on this earth, before he passed away. In all of this, it's the spirit that truly matters. The Scout Oath and Law will really put into practice, leave no room nor occasion for wars or strifes amongst nations. For God made this world full of beauty, and He gave you not only eyes to see it, but minds to understand it. If only we would have the sense to look at it in that light. So try and leave this world a little better than you found it. So that when it's your time to die, you guys can die happy, knowing that you haven't wasted your time, but that you've done your best.